Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for being here today. It takes unimaginable courage to stand up to everybody you know and everything you've ever believed in. It takes unquestionable strength to walk into a parliament who defines itself by denying your right to exist. But that's what Dr. Yousef Jabareen and Miko Peled did and do. And as a Palestinian, I only have admiration and awe for their fight for the cause. My name is Shirine Dajani, and I am the daughter of Palestinian refugees who were born in camps in Lebanon and Syria. My identity as a Palestinian was forged by my grandparents' and parents' stories and memories. I listened as they told me how they lost everything and had to start again from nothing. How they fought to survive in foreign lands, far away from their fields and their homes. I grew up angry at what the Israelis did to my country and my family, and angry at many in the Palestinian leadership who stood by and watched. It took me a long time to turn my anger into something more productive. It took people like Dr. Jabareen and Miko Peled who fight alongside each other for what's right. Anger can only get you so far. But what can get us even further is coming together. Miko Peled is a Jewish Israeli whose father was a general in the Israeli army. He grew up in a Zionist home, and he stood up, like his father, to his entire community to fight for what he believes was right. Dr. Yousef Jabareen is a Palestinian-Israeli human rights lawyer who was elected in 2015 to the Israeli parliament, or Knesset, in the Joint Arab List. He represents Palestinians in a government who defines their country as a Jewish nation, where Arabs are second or even third-class citizens. Dr. Jabareen and Miko Peled are considered traitors by many of their own peoples. This is what courage looks like. I couldn't be more honored to have them with us today. So please join me in welcoming them. Thank you very much for being here. So if it's okay with you, I'd love to hear your presentation. Dr. Miko Peled.
Thank you, Shirine, for the introduction. Can everybody hear me? Thank you for the kind introduction. It's a great honor to be here again in Bern. It's a great honor to be on the stage with Dr. Jabareen. I think the work that he does and the courage that he displays, working inside the lion's den, working inside the Knesset with probably some of the worst racists, some of the worst haters that you can possibly imagine, and to try to make some kind of, to bring about something positive, at least for his own people, is a very courageous thing. And so he has all my admiration and my respect. And thank you all for being here. I think that the work of the international community, the Palestine solidarity community here in Europe is extremely important. I think it's incumbent upon us to do more, to work harder, because Palestinians are being slaughtered every single day. Even as we sit here, denied water, denied electricity, denied life. And so it's incumbent upon all of us, I think, to do more, and I appreciate all of you being here today to listen to us. I'm going to begin with a little story. I wonder if all of you know who Ghassan Kanafani is. Ghassan Kanafani was a prolific Palestinian writer and political figure, and he was very brutally assassinated by Israel in 1972 in Beirut. Incidentally, I was at Tel Aviv airport just a couple of weeks ago, and in my luggage they saw a poster that I had with Ghassan Kanafani, and they pulled me out to ask me about this. He's been dead for more than 40 years and they're still afraid of him. But he was a writer. And the reason I bring him up is as follows. There's an interview with him in English that came up maybe 6 months ago on the internet. And what's very refreshing and inspiring about this interview is his clarity. The interviewer, who's Australian, tries to impose upon him this narrative, a certain narrative. And Ghassan Kanafani stands up and will not accept the narrative, will not accept the premise. And it's very refreshing because I think oftentimes people are afraid when we talk about Palestine, people are intimidated or afraid to be very clear. So he makes it very clear. He says, I'm sorry? People are afraid to be clear. And so he makes it very clear that the struggle of the Palestinian people is a struggle of a nation that has been dispossessed. It's a struggle of a nation for its liberty. It's a struggle of a nation for its human rights and so forth. And then he goes on to say a few more things. He says, for example, he talks about the Palestinian struggle. And he says, we, the Palestinians, prefer to die standing. We're going to fight till the last drop of blood to achieve justice. For us to liberate our country, to have dignity, to have respect, and our human rights is as essential as life itself. Palestinians are being killed whether they die, whether they're standing or they're laying down and sleeping in their beds. We've seen this over and over the last 7 decades. Now, if a white man says this, if an American says this, if an Israeli says this, then we call them heroes because they're fighting for justice, they're fighting for freedom. If a Palestinian says this, he's a terrorist. If a Palestinian talks about his right to fight for his people, to fight for justice, then immediately he's a terrorist and he has to be killed. And of course, that's what happened to Ghassan Kanafani and many, many thousands of other Palestinians. So this double standard is quite obvious, but the clarity of his words I thought was inspiring. Now, when people talk about Palestine, they call it a conflict, they call it a dispute, they call it an occupation. And it always seems like people are shooting but missing the target on purpose. Shooting and missing the target on purpose. And what I would like to propose, particularly here standing in Switzerland, is that over the last 69 years, there has been a genocide going on. There has been genocide to which the Palestinians have been the subject. And Israel has been the perpetrator. Now, it's very easy to find out what genocide is because we have the Geneva Convention. And if you read the Article 2 of the Geneva Convention, it describes the crime of genocide. And if we compare that to what Israel has been doing for the last 69 years, or what has been taking place in Palestine over the 69 years, it is almost identical. It's not identical, but it's very close to being identical. One of the important parts of this document is that it talks about intent. In other words, it's not just the destruction of a people. It's not just the destruction of a racial or ethnic group, but it's the intent. And when we look at the history of Palestine over the last 69 years, I don't think there can be any doubt that massacre after massacre, destruction after destruction, town after town being destroyed, there cannot be any doubt that this was done intentionally. That the destruction of the Palestinian people, whether in Gaza, whether during 1948, during the ethnic cleansing, whether in Jerusalem, whether on a daily basis, young Palestinians being killed, whether it's denying people water, that there's a policy here that is intentional. And again, drawing inspiration from Ghassan Kanafani's clarity, I would invite all of you to examine this and not be afraid to call the reality in Palestine what it truly is. It is genocide. There's also ethnic cleansing. And there's also a regime of apartheid that has been in place for the last 69 years. But people always say to me, why do you have to say these words? It's so offensive. It's so harsh. And my reply is, the word is offensive? The definition is what's offensive? The fact that 2 million people in Gaza have no water, that does not offend you? The fact that Israel on a regular basis murders thousands of civilians in Gaza, that does not offend you? The ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948 does not offend you? The racist laws do not offend you? It's the name that offends you? Unless we say what it really is, we will never be able to fix it. Can you imagine in South Africa, people would have said, don't call it apartheid. It's not a very nice name. Of course, in South Africa, they named it apartheid. The Israelis, the Zionists, were smarter. They gave it a kinder name. They call it Israel. But that's what Israel represents. It's a genocide. It's an ethnic cleansing. And it's an apartheid regime. Now, it's interesting because people talk about Palestine. One of the ways in which people describe Palestine, they say there's Israel proper, and then there's the occupied Palestinian territories. Well, my question is, what does Israel proper mean? And are there Palestinian territories somewhere that are not occupied? If you say the occupied Palestinian territories, it almost sounds like there are some Palestinian territories somewhere that are not occupied. In 1948, when supposedly the State of Israel was established, 1948 was the occupation of the majority of Palestine took place. That's when the majority of Palestine was occupied. But suddenly people choose to forget that, and they say, well, we're going to forget that. We're only going to focus on a small part of Palestine that Israel chose to occupy in 1967. But what actually happened in 1967? It wasn't the beginning of an occupation. We're now 50 years since that occupation, and people talk about commemorating 50 years of the occupation. It's 50 years of the completion of the occupation. The taking of the West Bank and Gaza was not the beginning of an occupation, it was the completion. They finished the job. And the generals, the Israeli generals, who were commanders at that time, my father was one of them, they called it finishing the job. Finishing the job that wasn't finished in 1948. And by doing so, when we recognize this, we can sweep away the whole ridiculous argument of a two-state solution. Because when Israel took the West Bank, it finalized establishing a single state in Palestine, all of Palestine, with exclusive rights for Jewish people. And that state is the State of Israel. So any notion that somehow there could be an Israeli government that would give it back, would allow the Palestinians a state, is complete science fiction. Within hours of taking the West Bank, Israel did in the West Bank what they did in 1948. Destroyed Palestinian towns, sent hundreds of thousands of Palestinians into exile, and began massive building for Jews, which is the whole purpose of taking the West Bank. It wasn't a mistake. The plan to take the West Bank, the plan to complete the conquest of the land of Israel was in place a very long time before that. The opportunity came up in 1967, and by doing this, of course, they thought they erased Palestine. And if you look at Israeli maps, in school books, in geography books, if you look at weather maps, there's no such thing as a West Bank. There's Judea and Samaria. And Judea and Samaria, like the Galilee, like the Negev, these are all parts of the State of Israel. There's even a Judea and Samaria district of the Israeli police force. And they have a pin that they wear with their logo. And the pin is the shape of the West Bank. And inside it says, Shomron Yehuda, Judea, Samaria. And they serve hundreds of thousands of Jewish citizens. Never mind that within that area there are about 3 million Palestinians, but that's not our problem as Israelis. They do not really exist. So I think it's important to come to terms with how the progression of the occupation came about and what the purpose of it was, what the intent of it was. The intent was to take all of Palestine, turn it into Israel, and somehow either get rid of or ignore the fact that there are Palestinians. And that's exactly what it was. Now I think it's important to talk about the Gaza Strip. People talk about the Gaza Strip as though it is some kind of a natural creation, a natural entity. There's nothing natural about the Gaza Strip. It was a line that was drawn, determined by Israel in the early 1950s, and it was a place to push into hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees. And today we know there are 2 million people living there with no access to clean water, irregular electric supply, no access to proper medicine, no access to proper nutrition, and on a regular basis, massive attacks, massive massacres that people like to call a war for reasons that I find puzzling. Because they're not a war, they are a massacre. They're not some kind of an offensive, a military offensive. They are a massacre intending to murder as many civilians as possible. And what's interesting about the Israeli attacks, they began very early on. And people look at the Gaza Strip and they say sometimes, why are there so many people there? Why is there such poverty there? Why is there such unemployment there? Nobody says, look at the education levels, how high they are. But none of this, why are they shooting rockets at us? Why is there Hamas? None of this would have happened had it not been for the initial crime of the ethnic cleansing of 1948. If we don't connect the reality in Gaza today to what happened 69, 70 years ago, of course nothing makes sense. If we refuse to look at what happened 69 years ago, nothing makes sense. We have to take a look and see the connection. There would be no refugees, there would be no resistance, there would be no poverty unless it was imposed on them by the brutality of this new creation of the State of Israel. And they began attacking the Gaza Strip as soon as they established the Gaza Strip. It was in the early 1950s that the Gaza Strip was finalized, and it was in the early 1950s that Israel began going in and committing massacres. There was a special military unit that was commanded by Ariel Sharon, the famous butcher who later on became prime minister. He's in one of these pictures. And this is this commando coming out of Gaza victorious after destroying terrorists. Who are these terrorists? These were poor refugees who would try to go back to their home sometimes, and they called them infiltrators. So then they would go in and they would commit a terrible massacre as punitive operations. Later on, they stopped calling them infiltrators, they called them fida'in, then they called them terrorists, today they call them Hamas. And of course, when they attack them today, it looks like this, modern weapons. So whereas in the 1950s, they killed dozens, maybe hundreds, in 2014, they murdered 2,500 people in broad daylight in 51 days. Never mind the countless that died later on from their injuries because Israel would not give them access to health care. And the hundreds of thousands of homeless and so forth. And this, of course, is the result. Destruction. This is Gaza. But of course, this reality doesn't only exist in Gaza. This is Jerusalem. Homes demolished. Homes and homes and homes, beautiful homes demolished. I took these pictures just recently, and you look at these homes and you say, why were they destroyed? Well, because they had no permit. Many people build without a permit, but when Jews build without a permit, nothing happens. You don't see the army come. You don't see bulldozers destroying. It's very hard to get a permit. To build, to add a room for your children, to close maybe a balcony. People do it, they get the permit later. But when Palestinians do it, the army shows up and destroys their homes. This is exclusive. Look at this, entire neighborhoods, entire cities, towns around Jerusalem that have become ghost towns. completely ghost towns. These were major thoroughfares, major business centers, dead, not a soul in sight. Beautiful apartment buildings, beautiful shops, dead because of the wall, because of bypass roads and so forth, and because of a policy of extermination and ethnic cleansing. When you look at these things, when I saw these things, the only word that I could think of was Holocaust. That was the only thing I could think of. This is Hebron, Shuhada Street in Hebron, dead. Used to be a major business center in the old city of Hebron, dead. And the question that people never ask for some reason is why? Why is Israel killing people in Gaza? Why is Israel destroying Palestinian towns in Jerusalem? Why is Israel imposing these catastrophic policies on a nation that has never had a military? Everybody who knows anything about this issue knows that Palestinians never posed a military threat to Israel, never posed an existential threat to Israel because they have never had a military. Israel bombs Gaza, dropping millions of tons of bombs on a civilian population. Why? There has never been a military threat from Gaza. So why are they killing so many people? Why are they doing it on a regular basis for almost 7 decades? Because if there is no military threat, what is their problem? And I would argue that the problem is not a military threat. The reality, the humanitarian disaster that exists today in the Gaza Strip, the existence of Palestinians in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, and of course in other parts of the country too, is a major threat, not to the security of the State of Israel, but to the legitimacy of the State of Israel. When you see people living as second and third class citizens, living under racist laws, when you see, like I said, the humanitarian catastrophe that is Gaza. And by the way, the UN keeps coming out with all these reports, and all these NGOs and human rights groups come out with reports saying that Gaza is going to be a humanitarian disaster. Going to be? It's been a humanitarian disaster for 7 decades. Going to be? Have they visited Gaza? Have they tried to live there? The existence of this reality points to the illegitimacy of the State of Israel, and that is why they must die. Because there are only 2 options. Leaving things the way they are is impossible. So you either fix the problem, for example, allow the refugees to return to their homes, spend all the money that you need to rebuild Gaza, if we're talking about the Gaza Strip. But we don't want the Arabs back. That's why there's a Gaza Strip, because they were kicked out. So the other option is to murder them and tell the world that it's their fault because they're terrorists. And by some stroke of magic, it works. 2 million people, defenseless, that never had a military force, are being murdered by Israel, whether it's through bombs or through denying them water and medicine. Israel claims that it's self-defense because they're terrorists, and the entire world shakes their hands like dummies and saying, yes, yes, Israel has a right to defend itself. Defend itself against what? When are people going to stand up and tell Israel that it is enough to lie, that we will not accept their lies anymore, we will not accept their murderous policies anymore? But the world shakes their head and said, yes, defense, self-defense, self-defense, and keep selling them weapons, keep selling them weapons. Like drug dealers, keeping the drug flow going. Which is, of course, if we look at the Geneva Convention, it is also a crime to be complicit in genocide. And that is the West, that is the EU, that is Europe, that is the United States. Complicit in this crime of genocide. Now, if there's one thing that Palestinians are not allowed to be associated with, it's resistance. They can be victims, they can be terrorists. But resistance means that maybe there's some legitimacy to their fight. Resistance sounds heroic. So when young Palestinians in Gaza try to fight that enormous behemoth of the Israeli military, they call them terrorists. Although if they were any other nation, they would be called heroes. But Palestinians are not allowed to be heroes. So hundreds of young Palestinians who were killed trying to fight in small battles within Gaza, of course, are forgotten. But we have to remember that that was a legitimate resistance, and they are heroes. But we can't talk about Palestinians in those kinds of terms. Now, when people talk about resistance, quite often they think, oh, you're talking about terrorism, you're talking about armed resistance, which, as we know, historically, armed resistance has had its role in the fight against colonialism and the fight of people for their liberation. But it doesn't always have to be the case. We know today, as a result of the experience in India, the result of the experience of blacks in America, of course, as a result of the South African experience, that resistance does not always have to involve violence, does not always have to be armed. We know that we can impose economic pressure. We know that there's isolation. We know that South Africa was not allowed to participate in the Olympics. They were not allowed to play rugby with other countries and so forth. And we know, and we should respect, and we should take part in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions. People hear BDS and they suddenly become afraid. They suddenly become worried about being called, anti-Semitic and so on and so forth. But it's important to take a look at the BDS movement. The call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions was a gift to all of us from Palestine. It was a gift by Palestinian civil society to the rest of the world, to people of conscience, giving us not only a roadmap, but very clear guidelines and very clear demands. Israel divided Palestinians into refugees, the Palestinians who are so-called Israeli citizens, and the Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza. The BDS demands deal with all three. And what are these demands that people are so afraid of? Ending the Israeli military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and getting rid of the wall, recognizing the rights of Palestinian citizens inside of Israel to equal rights, and respecting international law and allowing the refugees to return, the right of return. The three most reasonable demands you can imagine. All of them remedial. All of these are remedial demands. In other words, trying to remedy a condition that exists today. Nothing in the demands of the BDS says anything against the Jews. Nothing is targeting the Jews that live in Palestine. Nothing here is against Israel. It's all to remedy the conditions under which the Palestinians live. To take this and equate this with terrorism, to take this and equate it with anti-Semitism, is nonsense of the worst kind. It's absolute nonsense to equate BDS with terrorism or anti-Semitism. It is remedial, and it says nothing about hurting anyone. It's only trying to remedy conditions that were imposed on the Palestinians by Israel. Completely reasonable, completely dedicated, and by the way, very effective. If anybody has any doubts that the BDS movement has been effective, then there's a lot of information that we can take a look at and see that it's been very, very effective. And of course, Israel's panic, I should say, as a result of the BDS movement is a testament to that. Now, there's something very interesting that has been taking place in the United States, around the world, and in Palestine itself, which is equating charity to Palestinians with terrorism. It takes a sick mind of a special kind to equate charity with terrorism. But Israel cannot allow any legitimization of any Palestinian demands, including the demand or the striving for charity. So there was a case in the United States that was kind of the main pillar, the main case, which was called the case of the Holy Land Foundation. And what they said was the Holy Land Foundation, this was a Muslim charity. They were supporting orphans, and they were supporting the families of prisoners. And they made all of that criminal. And you have to think, what kind of a sick mind can take charity and make it criminal? How could it possibly work? Well, there are enough sick minds to put it together. Now, I'm going to show you pictures of 5 men. 5 Palestinians in the United States are in federal prison now for many, many years. These are men that were associated with the Holy Land Foundation. And the reason I investigated this is because it's the subject of a book that I'm about to publish. But this equation, look at the sentences, look at the long sentences they received. The bottom 2, 65 years. I visited these men in federal prison, all but one actually, in the United States. And what they said is this. They showed that the Holy Land Foundation supported the orphans. And they had a list of orphans and the cause of death of the father. And the cause of death, in many cases, it says martyr, which is really a term of respect for somebody who died. What the prosecution, which was the state of the U.S. government, in collusion with the state of Israel, using Israeli experts as witnesses, said, these are all suicide bombers. When you support the children of these people, you're encouraging suicide bombers. Well, 2 things they left out. Number 1, none of the men on those lists were ever involved in any kind of terrorism or any kind of any kind of military or armed struggle. Number 2, none of the suicide bombers that were active when they were in Palestine had children. So none of these orphans were connected to anybody who did anything that has to do with suicide bombing or terrorism or anything like that. But who wants to confuse the facts with a good story? And then they said, and this is happening now in Palestine too, they just closed the Palestinian National Fund, part of which supports the families of prisoners. Now we know Israel has been holding thousands and thousands of Palestinian political prisoners. So they say, well, if you support their families, you're supporting terrorism. Now check Israeli sources, you'll find out that most of the Palestinians in Israeli jails have never been charged with violence, most of them. In other words, these are all political prisoners. But even supporting their families, even paying the lawyers who defend them is now associated with terrorism. This is just how far this anti-Palestinian sentiment has gone. Not even charity to Palestinians can be legitimate. And again, it's one of those issues that we have to get our heads around and fight this. Which again, like I said, this is a copy, this is my book, this is the book that's coming out. Like I said, it's going to come out in the fall. It's called Injustice, and it's that story. Because it's a story that nobody talks about. These men are in jail and nobody hears about it. These are kind of sideline stories, but that have to be told because this is a reality. This is a reality of an entire nation where now they can't even get charity. Never mind they don't get support from the rest of the world. I think that, like I said earlier, those of us who sit here and in rooms like this around the world, we can talk about the issues of Palestine, we can talk about the suffering of Palestinians, and we should. But more importantly, it is incumbent upon all of us who are rich and free and alive at the same time, to find hope and then act. We do not have the luxury to say it is hopeless. We do not have the luxury to say it's too complicated. We do not have the luxury to say, well, it's too bad. We do not have that luxury. We must find hope and we must act. And there are only 2 options. It's not that difficult. The reality in Palestine offers us 2 options. The first one is to accept Israel. Accepting Israel means accepting an occupied Palestine and a state that offers exclusive rights for people like myself, Jewish people. It means thousands of political prisoners, it means massacres in Gaza, it means denying Palestinians water. This is the reality. This is how Israel has always been. And that's one option, to accept the state of Israel in Palestine, a state that offers exclusive rights for Jewish people in an Arab land. We can accept that. That's one option. There is no other Israel, by the way. Some people think that there's this idea of a liberal, friendly kind of an Israel that will make peace with the Palestinians. There's no evidence to that. There's never been any evidence to that. That has never existed. And I think we can safely say will never exist. So that's one option. The other option, however, is a free Palestine, a free democratic Palestine with equal rights, that respects human rights and respects the rights of refugees to return and respects the right of political movements to fight for justice and so on. That option exists too. And I would argue, or actually I would invite you to decide which of these two options offers hope. Which of these two options offers us hope for the future, for Palestinians as well as Israelis? And I would argue that the second option is the one that offers hope, and I would encourage all of you to stand behind that option and to realize that in order to get to that option, BDS is the tool, and BDS is the gift that we were given in order to get to that point. Because no privileged people ever give up their privilege willingly. And I want to close with this image. This is an image that we took in a refugee camp, in a Palestinian refugee camp, which is so horrifying, so horrible, so tragic, the life in that camp, that none of us would be smiling. In fact, those of us that did visit, we couldn't stop our tears. The reality is so harsh. And look at these children. Now, why are these beautiful smiling faces forced to live in an environment without clean water, without sewage, without proper health care, constantly being bombarded? Why do they have to live this? Because Israel denies them the right to return. Israel has banned Palestinians from returning to their homes. So these children, who are probably the grandchildren of the original refugees, are forced to live like this. And this is no more than half an hour, maybe an hour from their original homes. But they are banned from returning because they're Palestinians, because Israel said so. And I invite all of you to think about the term Free Palestine. I have it right here, also on my thing. What does it mean when we say Free Palestine? Does it mean a third of Palestine? Does it mean a little bit of Palestine here and a little bit of Palestine there? No. Palestine is an entire country. Free Palestine means from the river to the sea. It means Al-Jalil, it means Al-Nakab, it means Jerusalem, it means Haifa and Jaffa. A free Palestine must be a free Palestine, all of it, with no checkpoints, and with no racist laws, and with equality, and equal access to water, and equal access to travel. And if we do our job, all of us, and if we act correctly, then Palestine absolutely can be free, and will be free, and much sooner than most people think. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Peled. We'll now take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back with Dr. Yousef Jabareen. Thank you. I'd like to welcome Dr. Yousef Jabareen. Thank you very much for being with us.
Good evening, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Where's the response? Yeah. Well, I would like definitely to start by thanking the Swiss Palestinian Association for organizing this panel, and would definitely like to thank Miko for also taking the time and share this panel and give his excellent presentation about the situation back in Palestine. And I would like also to thank you for not just for your courage and your thorough understanding of the situation, but also for highlighting some of the important discussion that usually is not being heard, neither here in Europe nor in the US. So I hope that the message was clear on that. And I think Miko has covered very deeply the general situation in Israel-Palestine, which would leave me some time to go more in depth on the issue of Palestinians in Israel. That maybe I think was maybe the general title of this panel. And sometimes I feel kind of that this group of Palestinians is the forgotten Palestinians. And I think Ilan Pape has a new book about the forgotten Palestinian, the Palestinian who sometimes Palestinians themselves, but also the general world has forgot about them. And I will take the first bite of my presentation to talk about this group, which is basically my small community back home, and then move in the second part to discuss the situation back home in general, and then basically communicate with the last issues that Miko has addressed. In the first slide, I have tried to make the differentiation between the different Palestinian groups, but by saying different Palestinian groups, I refer mainly to the political and legal situation. We are definitely one people, and these different groups is basically the creation of the Nakba, the creation of the 1948 catastrophe of the Palestinian people. And as you will see here today, we are about 11 to 12 million Palestinians. Within Israel proper, with the 1948 borders, today the Palestinian native community is about 1.5 million, constituting around 1/5 of the population within Israel. Now, who are those Palestinians? We are the indigenous, we are the remaining indigenous Palestinian people who survived the Nakba, who survived the 48 war, who were not expelled from their homeland. And an important fact to remember about the history of Palestinians, that only 15%, about 10 to 15% of the Palestinian people survived the war in their homeland. So when Israel was created back in 1948, only 15% of the Palestinians who used to live in the area in which Israel was established survived the war. Back then, about 160,000 back in 1948. How many Palestinians were before 48? How many Palestinians? About 1,200,000 or 300 million. What happened with the rest of the Palestinians? So as I said, 160,000 remained in the border of the newly established state. What happened with the rest? They became refugees, either in the West Bank or in the adjacent Arab countries. This is the issue of the refugees that still going on for about 70 years. The second group that I refer to is Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Since 1967, under the Israeli military occupation, about 2.5 million in Gaza, and about 2.5 million in the West Bank, and about 2 million in Gaza. And there is also the group of Palestinians in East Jerusalem, that they have also some kind of like special status. Because back in 1967, Israel decided to annex East Jerusalem against definitely international law. And Israel granted Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem, who survived the war, some kind of like Israeli residency, but not citizenship. So today we are speaking about 300,000 Palestinians in East Jerusalem who have some kind of like a shaky status. They were not granted citizenship as Palestinians back in 1948, but they were annexed with keeping some kind of like shaky status of being resident of Israel, some kind similar maybe to the American green card. So they even not entitled to vote for the parliament, although they hold basically Israeli residency. So when addressing, the different Palestinian group from a political and legal perspective, we could identify basically 4 different groups: Palestinians in Israel, Palestinians in East Jerusalem, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and Palestinian refugees. And I think the main maybe point about these 4 groups, about all the Palestinian people, that each of these groups has been historically denied the basic rights, the basic human rights. Palestinians in Israel have historically been denied the basic right of being equal citizens within Israel. And I will address this more deeply soon. Palestinians in East Jerusalem, who have been under occupation from 1967. And in this status, they are not citizens and they don't enjoy equal rights, and they were annexed to Israel against international law. And there's the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza denying the basic right of self-determination. And the Palestinian refugees, today about maybe 5 to 6 million, who are still denied the right to return, a right that was recognized by the General Assembly of the UN in the Resolution 194. So as I said, I will focus maybe a little bit in the beginning about the issue of Palestinians in Israel, a native community constituting about 1/5 of the population. Today, we're about 1.5 million, so our number has doubled since 1948, about 9 to 10 times. And interestingly, over 90% of our community, again, within Israel, live in entirely Arab towns and villages. So there is a clear housing separation and residency separation within Israel when it comes to Jews and Arabs. And I think the main issue has been that the Israeli policy toward its Palestinian citizens has been a policy that look at them as a security threat, treated with a great deal of hostility by state authority and the Jewish majority alike. We're speaking about a very vulnerable socio-economically and very poor community, and also very young community. But I think this number, about 50% under the age of 18, I think it's today right for the entire Palestinian people. The entire Palestinian people is young. And I think that 50% of our people is under the age of 18. Just examples, that number of families under poverty line is over three times more than Jewish families. Average earning is 2/3 that of the Jewish citizens. Unemployment rate is way higher than that of the Jewish community. And only 31% of Arabs qualifying for university acceptance on the matriculation exam compared to 76% of Jews. And additional interesting numbers about this community, that 25% of our community are basically internally displaced persons. Internal refugees. Internal refugees, in the meaning that it's right that Israel granted them Israeli citizenship, but Israel wouldn't allow them, even though they were still within Israel and they were granted Israeli citizenship, Israel wouldn't allow them to go back to their original villages and homes. That's how we see this terms of present absentees. So many of our communities are present absentees. What does that mean, present absentees? That according to the citizenship law, we were regarded as a presence and we were giving Israel citizenship. But according to other laws, we were granted as refugees, as absentees, and our property basically was confiscated. Until 1966, our community was under military rule, and we were denied basic rights of movement, of freedom of expression, and there were also some bloody events in our relationship with the State of Israel. The Kafar Qasim massacre back in 1956, the Land Day protests back in 1976, and the 2000 October events where 13 Palestinian citizens were shot to death by the Israeli security forces. When I try to analyze their legal status, and I'm originally a lawyer. I graduated from the Hebrew University, and then I went to the law school at Georgetown to do my doctorate, and my focus was human rights and constitutional rights. So basically, my analysis here would be more from a human rights perspective and the legal perspectives. I would basically mention 4 main forms of exclusion that are experienced by the Arab Palestinian community in Israel. The first one, I think, maybe is the most important one. And I say that this is the most important one because sometimes people just don't think about it and they are not aware of it. This is the fact that the Israeli legal system includes tens of laws that by definition give special arrangement and special privilege, but only for Jewish citizens. By definition, the law itself will give the special arrangement only for Jews. Maybe the well-known example that people know about it is that law of return. That if you are a Jew or your family of a Jew, you have an automatic right to come to Israel and claim citizenship. Or the symbols of the state, that they are exclusive Jewish Zionist symbols. And these are by laws. But there are, I could give you the examples here, but there are also laws on the land housing and land ownership. The special status that the legal system would give for the Jewish Zionist institutions within Israel. Although these institutions openly say that they serve only the Jewish community. Laws in education and culture that would recognize the collective identity and the collective heritage and the collective history, but only of the Jewish community. And no similar recognition exists when it comes to the Arab Palestinian minority. Similarly, law on religion. The law that would recognize elected religious leadership within, but only within the Jewish community, and no similar recognition for the Arab community, whether they are Muslims or they are Christians. Sometimes even in simple daily issues, like now we are in the holy month of Ramadan. And the end of the holy month of Ramadan start Eid al-Fitr. There is no even religious authority within Israel from the Muslim community that have the authority to declare when is the Eid, when is the feast. So we look only at the Palestinian authority or to the Arab world to basically have the decision if it's Eid or not. And that's because there is no recognition of an official religious leadership of the community. And lastly, the issue of political participation. It's the fact that the Israeli law itself says that you can't be elected to the Knesset, to the Israeli parliament, if you work to disqualify Israel and to negate Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. I mean, this is the terminology that was adopted by the law. I guess all of us have heard now the presentation of Miko Peled. I think if I make the same presentation several times, I might run in danger of being disqualified from running to the parliament. Although I wouldn't commit any criminal act or something But the fact that by itself that I discuss these issues and being very critique of Israel's definition as a Jewish state, I might run into the possibility of being disqualified from running to the Knesset. So what we learn from these laws, and again, I have counted at least 50 laws. At least 50 laws. What we learn from them? The main thing that we learn from this is that there is no equal citizenship in Israel. When we speak about democracy, the basic principle that we learn about democracy is equality, is equal citizenship, that all citizens are equal. By law, by definition. I mean, in a practice, things might be a bit different. Like, African Americans in the US, the law promised them equality after the civil rights movement. In a practice, they are still suffer from discrimination. And that's the case maybe with other minorities. But at least the basic principle of any state that declare about itself that it's a democratic state, it's the equal citizenship. The legal system in Israel does not recognize equal citizenship as a principle. And this is the immediate result of these tens of laws that would give basically this special status for Jewish citizens and maybe Jews around the world, while we, the indigenous Palestinian community, are denied comparable arrangement or comparable rights. So in fact, that's a clear classification of the Israeli citizenship. There is, first-class citizenship enjoyed by Jewish citizens and could be enjoyed by, a Jewish immigrant to Israel who just claimed citizenship 2 days ago. And I mean it, 2 days ago that immigrated to Israel from Russia or from other country, and now he gets the Israel citizenship, and because he's a Jew, so he's entitled to all these arrangements about land ownership, about religious rights, about the symbols of the state, about identity and language and heritage. And if you are a non-Jews, mainly the Arab Palestinian community, you are in inferior status. It's a second or third or fourth class citizen. So when we talk to people around the world and we say that we reject the idea of Israel being defined as a Jewish state, and that if you are a true Democrat and you are a true human being, you must reject such an idea, not just as a legal principle, but also as a moral principle. So I reject the idea of Israel being a Jewish state because for me it's clear that this idea means that I will be in an inferior status in my homeland. In my homeland. How can I do that? How can I do that? I mean, anybody of you would accept the fact that he would be looked at as an inferior citizen, as an inferior human being in his homeland? And this is exactly why we say that Israel cannot identify itself in one hand as a Jewish state and on the other hand as a democracy. Because in a Jewish state you give superior status for Jewish citizens. But if you are a democracy, you are supposed to give equal status to all citizens. Especially if they are the native, the indigenous inhabitant of the land. So here, in the slides, I'll be happy to share with. I try to give some examples of these specific laws. I wouldn't go, into details in my presentation here, But these are, some examples. So that was the first level of exclusion, by law, by definition. However, even in other areas that you cannot identify specific law that would create discrimination, there is no equality as well. That's the socio-economic discrimination. That's the institutionalized discrimination resulted by discriminatory decision-making process, the underrepresentation in all levels, discrimination allocation of resources, discrimination allocation of land. It's basically the continued process of confiscating land of Palestinians. Arabic in Israel. It's legally defined as a national language, although there's an attempt to change that. Its status in daily life is far inferior to that of Hebrew. I visited Canada a few months ago, and in Canada, as you know, French is considered as an official language alongside English. Now, I mention Canada because the French-speaking community there is also about 20-25%, maybe similar to Palestinians in Israel. And whenever I go to the Supreme Court, to the Parliament, to any public federal office, you will see that both languages are respected, and you could speak in both languages in all the public sphere, but not in Israel. The public sphere is exclusively in Hebrew. So in the Knesset, for example, if I want, I can speak in Arabic, but nobody could understand. So it doesn't make any sense to speak in Arabic because there is no translation. And the Jewish community, they don't study Arabic, so they don't know Arabic as well. Arab education in Israel. Arab schools have their own curriculum. However, it's designed and supervised by the Minister of Education. And it's a very absurd situation in which, for example, before being elected to the Knesset, I was teaching at the University of Haifa. So I would design my own classes for my students, mainly Jewish students. I would have like 200 students that I would design the content of the class and the material. But now when my kids are in schools, I can't even change one word in their curriculum. Not even one word. Why? Because everything is controlled by the Minister of Education, and there is a clear policy of denying the history, the heritage, the identity of our community, of our people, and basically all the content is decided by the Minister of Education, and there's a clear policy of fostering the Jewish heritage and history even in the Arab schools. I mean, these functions just to give you the differences between our percentage, which is the upper level, and then the actual allocation of resources that we get from different ministries. And these are some statistics about the differences, socio-economic gaps between Arabs and Jews. And there is also the issue of what I call it societal discrimination, hate speech and racism in our daily life. It's the daily experience of our youth to get jobs in the Jewish areas, mainly in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem, or to get apartment, to being rejected just because you're an Arab or just because your name is Muhammad. And that definitely has, resulted in, was one of the reasons for the inferior socio-economic situation of the community, especially that the government is not investing in our community, not in housing projects, and not in industrial areas. The issue of racism is becoming a main source of worry for our community, For example, a study that was conducted at Haifa University showed that 75% of Jewish pupils think that Arabs are ignorant, uncivilized, and dirty, and the majority, not even 2/3 of Israeli Jews think that Arabs should be encouraged to immigrate from Israel. In the last few years, we have witnessed many international reports about the situation of Palestinians in Israel that recognized the inferior status of the community. I here refer to the UN, AU, and even US Department of State issued reports supporting these claims, noting the institutional, legal, and societal discrimination faced by Arab citizens of Israel. And as I said, the combination of discriminatory laws along with notable socio-economic gaps between the two groups have resulted in two classes of citizenship in Israel. Those who are full, equal, and worthy partners in the state, and those who are second or third class citizens. And when we try to think about some of the main ideas or main demands that we raise as a national native minority within Israel, I could share with you maybe the main 10 points that we would usually emphasize in our political platform and in our communication within the international community, but also definitely within Israel itself. So the first point would be recognizing and protecting the Arab minority in Israel as a national and indigenous minority with a distinct collective identity, ethnically, linguistically, religiously, and culturally. Guaranteeing full equality of rights on a civil and national basis. Guaranteeing equal status for Arabic in all areas of the public sector alongside Hebrew. I give the example of like French in Canada, for example. 4, granting Arabs the right to self-steer their own educational, culture, and religious institutions similar to the current status of the Orthodox Jewish educational system. So when it comes to minority within the Jewish public, they have some kind of like self-steering of their cultural issues and educational issues, but not when it comes to the Arab minority. 5, guaranteeing full and democratic participation and effective representation in governmental, administrative, and decision-making bodies. 5 is important because it's important for me to emphasize that it's true that we have the right to vote, and there are authentic Arab Palestinian representative of our community in the parliament. However, this representation is kind of like a talking representation, because we have never got any political influence through this representation. We have never been part any of the Israeli government or any of the political decision-making process. So we are basically excluded from that process, to the extent that some in our communities have been questioning why we are taking part in the election. And I think this is maybe what Shirine was referring to when she said, I wouldn't use the word traitors, but some people would think that we should boycott and not taking part in this kind of like, being a talking representative of the community. However, we still believe that it's important for us to try our best and to use all possible ways to protect the rights of our community, including through participating in the election. So when we're in the election, we're maybe at least understanding what's going on, understanding, behind the scene discussions, knowing about possible plans that the government is preparing, but also we are leaders of the community on the ground, on the field, in demonstrations, in different protests that we do, but also we represent our community in the international arena and bring their voices to Europe, to the UN, to the US. So sometimes, as a representative, as a member of the Knesset, sometimes I feel that my role is not about being in the Knesset. It's less important being in the Knesset because my political influence is extremely limited. But maybe my political leadership is more about, being in the field with our community, leading the protest, and representing our case, vis-a-vis the Jewish public and vis-a-vis the international community. So sometimes when I speak at the Knesset, I'm not necessarily worried about the few members of the Knesset that are in the, in that session, because my speeches are broadcasted, to the general public. So I'm worried about, the general public and trying to address the general public from this position. 6 is guaranteeing special allocation of national material resources to address socio-economic gaps. This is the issue of institutionalized discrimination that we have been facing since the establishment of the state. One of the leading examples is the fact that Israel has confiscated over 50% of the land that we used to own in the aftermath of 48, not the refugees' lands. But even the land that were recognized in our ownership as Palestinian citizens, Israel has confiscated over 50% of that land, which resulted in a situation in which we live in a crowded and poor, entirely Arab communities, and the land that we own today as Arabs in Israel is less than 3.5%. So within Israel, in the borders of 1948, Palestinians today, we own less than 3.5%. 7, appropriately recognizing the Arab community in state symbols. So we are arguing that the symbols cannot be an exclusive symbols of the majority group. Guaranteeing equality and fairness in immigration and citizenship for all citizens and residents. That definitely an issue that would bring in the issue of the rights of the Palestinian refugees. Whenever I travel outside Israel and meet my fellow Palestinians who are refugees, Shirine, Firas, and others, I just think about this, absurdness situation in the Israeli legal system, in which that if you have a family relationship, if you happen to have a family relationship to a Jew in Argentina, in Brazil, in Europe, you have an automatic right to come to Israel and immediately have Israeli citizenship and live in Israel. But if you are a Palestinian, and your family might be still even there. Like in my case, I have extended family in the West Bank, I have extended family in the US, I have extended family, all of them are refugees in Europe. I have no legal opportunity to bring them to live with me. And since 2003, there was an amendment to the Israeli citizenship law that Palestinian youth are not even allowed to bring their spouses to live with them in Israel. And I know thousands of cases of that one spouse is a Palestinian citizen of Israel, the other spouse from the West Bank, and he or she cannot unite within Israel. And they have to decide whether to live outside Israel or just to split. And one story of one of my closest friends who studied with me in the US and fell in love with the Palestinian woman from Bethlehem. They finished, I think, 2005, 2006, their study, want to go back. He went back to Israel, she went back to Bethlehem, and they were not able to live together in Israel. I mean, it's absurd, but that's the reality of thousands of families. And after a few years of trying and going to the Supreme Court, blah, 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 nothing worked. So they went back to the US. That was their only possibility to live together as one family. And that's still going on. That's not something that's still going on these days. And by the way, this case has reached the Supreme Court of Israel twice, in 2006 and 2012. In both cases, there was major split within the Israeli Supreme Court. It was majority of 6-5. 6-5, very close. And the 5 who were in the minority says that it's a clear discrimination. There is the right for these people to unite with their family. However, there were 6 justices who would still adhere to the government position, and they basically refrained from striking down the law. And I wanted to emphasize this split of the Supreme Court because that was a clear racist law. And we thought that our last resort would be, Supreme Court. It's the Israeli Court of Justice. That's the name, the High Court of Justice. And if you can't protect your rights in the Knesset, so your last resort would be the Supreme Court. And if you lose there, what you have else? Nine, recognizing the historical rights of the Arab minority to its homeland, addressing internal refugees, and recognize communities and land rights and the claims. These are issues that I have addressed them. It's basically saying that it's not just about fixing these discriminatory laws, but it's also about recognizing the historical rights of Palestinians, whether they are citizens or not citizens, whether they are in the West Bank or they are refugees. There is the issue of the historical right, and you have to address these historical rights. 10, recognizing and protecting the Arab minority's special relationship to the other Palestinians and Arabs in the region. It's the issue of allowing us to communicate with our people, with our Palestinian people, and with the Arab world, and not basically recognizing and not basically treating this relation as if we are communicating with enemies, because we are communicating with our own people and the extended people, but this is not recognized. So basically these are 10 demands that would summarize I would say the human rights struggle of the Arab Palestinian community within Israel. I would close I would close by saying that it might be very symbolic to hear Miko presentation and my presentation in 2017, exactly 100 years after the Balfour Declaration. 100 years. Why I'm saying that? Because when I read the Balfour Declaration, what was it about? It was about promising the Jews Palestine as their homeland, their national homeland. Now, back in 1917, 100 years ago, Jews in the area of historical Palestine were less than 10%, maybe less than 5%. So think about this declaration, this kind of like declaration of promise that you promise Jews in historical Palestine who are less than 10% Palestine as their homeland. And when referring to the Palestinians in historical Palestine, the Balfour Declaration didn't mention them as Palestinians, but as what? As non-Jews. So the Balfour Declaration was about promising homeland for Jews who were tiny minority, And about the majority, the Balfour Declaration referred to them as non-Jews. It said that non-Jews have civic and religious rights. So it's basically 100 years ago, the attitude was to try to promise Jews the historical Palestine as their national homeland, and those who are not Jews, they have only civic and religious rights. They don't have national rights. This is exactly what we are witnessing these days under this Netanyahu government. Netanyahu has been in power since 2009, and this is exactly, I think, what he is basically declaring and what he is basically doing on the ground. Saying basically that there is no Palestinian people, there is no national rights for the Palestinian people. The exclusive right for self-determination is only for Jews, and that's the new nationality law. It says clearly that there's an exclusive right for self-determination for Jews in historical Palestine. And those who are not Jews, Palestinian people, very soon they will be the majority, have civil and religious rights, some kind of like self-ruling, limited self-ruling in the major Palestinian cities, Ramallah, Jenin, and Bethlehem. So it's about one state. Definitely not a two-state. It's about one state, but it's not a democratic state. It's not a binational state. It's a clear state of apartheid. It's of apartheid and of occupation. Because I think that the word occupation is even, the level of the occupation, I would say even harder. It's one stage of oppression which is beyond apartheid. Because it's not just about segregation. It's about segregation, it's about apartheid, but it's also about military rule. And about denying the Palestinian people their basic right of self-determination. So I would close by saying, when you think about the issue of Palestinians, it's extremely important to think about at least these three levels of discussion. The issue of Palestinians in Israel and their right of full equality on the civil and the national level. The issue of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and self-determination. And the issue of refugees. That's why when I think about a solution of two-state based on 1967, which has been, the solution offered by the Arab League since 2002, but there is no partner in Israel for such a solution. When I think about 1967 borders, I know that Palestinians will be left, even if we fulfill this solution, with only 22% of their historical land. Only 22% of their historical land. So how come that Palestinians should agree to that? And they are agreeing, at least, according to the Palestinian leadership with that. I think the only way to understand this acceptance of two-state solution based on 1967 borders, which would leave Palestinians with less than a quarter of their historical land, is by saying that this is only a part of the solution. And the next stage would be simultaneously to guarantee all these equal rights for Palestinians in Israel, including historical rights and the restitution of land and etc., but also the issue of the refugees and guaranteeing their right of return. So we have to see the Palestinian discourse about two-state solution as within this broader picture of the different situation of Palestinians within Israel, West Bank and Gaza, and the refugees. I understand that when I see things on the ground, people might say that it's maybe a long walk to go. But as I just told you, I studied, the African American civil rights movement. And I think that if you ask an African American back in the 50s or in the 60s, that you will transfer the legal system and you might have even African American presidents, that would be something that nobody will take it seriously, but that happened. And if you ask Nelson Mandela when he was in jail, that very soon he will be released and he will be the president of democratic South Africa, nobody will think that this will happen. So I think if we look at the experience of the history, so the experience of the history would teach us that rights should be fulfilled. And this is the reason why Miko and I are here, and we will continue to address you and the international community until the rights of our people are fulfilled. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jabareen. That was an excellent speech. Thank you so much, Mr. Peled. If it's okay with you, we can proceed to the discussion. I have a first question for you, Dr. Jabareen. How do you work around the censorship in the Knesset? So what issues can you tackle? How has your experience been at the Knesset?
It's not official censorship. But when you have the law that says that if you negate Israel as a Jewish state, you might be disqualified, I mean, this is against any notion of freedom of expression and democracy. I mean, how come you tell people what to think, what you are allowed to present? So it's kind of like if I advocate very strongly the issue of a binational state, I might be disqualified. So that, I mean, does it make any sense in a political, in a political situation where the whole point is about basically presenting ideas and presenting competing ideas? But one of the major challenges that I have been facing in my last 2 years in the Knesset is the fact that some of the basic facts that I know and that are recognized by the international community are now being challenged by the right wing. So one of the leading examples, which is definitely the main example, is the status of the West Bank, for example, and the status of the settlements. Until a few years ago, I mean, it would be common that to argue that settlements are against international law. And people would tell you, well, maybe it's against international law, but that's fine. That's part of our plans, etc., etc. But now people are starting in the right wing to question this argument itself, that it's not clear anymore that it's against international law. And when the annexation law that was passed by the Knesset a few months ago, the argument was not that the government is willing to find a solution to some of the illegal building in the settlements. That was not the discussion. The discussion in the Knesset was about the need to annex Area Cs to Israel, openly, clearly. And Area Cs are over 60% of the West Bank. So leading ministers and leading decision makers within the Israeli government would stand in the Knesset and say, we would like to annex Area Cs to Israel. So why I'm saying that? Because I think a few years ago, correct me if I'm wrong, a few years ago, you wouldn't hear this clearly from ministers and from people in the government. They would act like this, and they would enlarge settlements and continue to build. But they wouldn't say that we would like to annex Area Cs and we are against Palestinian state, etc., etc. So what I'm saying is now this is very clear, very, very open. And you have ministers not just saying that they are against Palestinian state in 1967 borders, but they are saying that there is no Palestinian people. And that's exactly, what I was discussing about the Balfour Declaration, that there is no Palestinian people who is entitled to a state. I mean, the argument about there is no Palestinian people is an argument that says that there is no national right for Palestinian as a people to have a state. So what we are remained with, this is exactly what I said. We are remained with some kind of like self-ruling, maybe some kind of like municipal ruling in the main Palestinian cities, but even that would be on less than 10% of historical Palestine. Because the understanding is that that would happen only in the main Palestinian cities, and Area Cs would be annexed to Israel. And one of the ministers in this government says that I know that in the Area Cs there are about 100,000 Palestinians, and I have no problems to give them Israeli residency. So they are in a position now even to think about solution for Palestinians who live in Area Cs. So that's the new reality that we are now facing in the Knesset. That the issues of racism and issues of apartheid are not hidden anymore. They are now open. They are clear. That's why I try to speak to people in the international community, with the AU people, with the UN people, saying, well, look at this government. It says that it's against two-state solution 1967. So what you are waiting for in the past, they said Netanyahu said, well, two-state solution might be acceptable, not saying 1967. So at least there was some kind of like declaration, what's the vision. But now that the government is saying clearly that they are against that, so what is the world is waiting for? And here when we come to the BDS, if nothing is working, if no other tool is being enough strong to protect the Palestinian, what remained from the Palestinian right, the 22% of their historical land. So you have to think about the BDS as something that was successfully used in South Africa and could be successfully used in the case of Israel-Palestine.
So would you think that BDS is the most effective method of resistance right now available to the Palestinians and to the community?
And under the current situation, yes. I mean, one of the leading tools. Because you need to pressure Israel to act differently. Especially that the official position of Israel is not accepting the idea of a two-state solution. So now you need a tool to basically dictate something that it's in consensus within the international community. It's not just the Palestinian point of view. Now it's the international community point of view. And it's the international law point of view.
Now, going back to what you said about how hawkish the Israeli government is right now, with Netanyahu being probably one of the most right-wing prime ministers that Israel has had, what's the future, in your view, of Arab Israelis in the Knesset? Do you think their time is limited and that the Israeli government will take a decision to throw the Palestinians out?
There is an ongoing attempt by the Israeli government to limit the political maneuver of the Arab representation in the Knesset. And by the way, one of the laws that it's now being presented, that if you as an MK advocate BDS, you might be disqualified. You are not supposed to take part in seminars or in conferences that call for BDS. And there is a new law that was adopted a few months ago. For the first time ever, the Knesset took the authority to expel MK. To expel MK that was elected. if there is a majority of 90 MKs, 90 out of 120. Now the only chance to get 90 when you have on the other side, an Arab MK. Because our list is about 13, maybe along with the Meretz, the other leftist party, it's 5, so that's together 18. So easily they could get to 90 MKs to expel an MK. And by the way, to expel an MK by decision of the Knesset, also on their political views. So now there is a renewed attempt to try to limit the freedom of speech, the maneuver of MKs in the Knesset, and the same thing with the human rights NGO. The last declaration from Netanyahu was when I left the country that he said that the human rights NGO shouldn't get any support from the international community. So it's trying basically to attack Arab MKs and to delegitimize their political opinions, to attack human rights NGOs, to attack, by the way, also Supreme Court justices. In Israel there is the seniority system to appoint the president of the Supreme Court. The current candidate for the presidency is a justice who was in the minority in the case of the family reunification, who said that this law is discriminatory against Palestinians. For that reason, now the government is not willing to appoint her as a president of the Supreme Court. So there is also an attack on the limited power that the Supreme Court in Israel has been expressing in the last few years.
With that going on at the same time, there's a feeling that the One Democratic State movement is gaining momentum, whether it's within Israel and the occupied territories or in the rest of the world. How do you see this movement in Israel? Are people talking about it more? Is there any mention of it in the Knesset or in the Jewish community, or is it just completely outside of talks? The One Democratic State movement, as opposed to a two-state solution.
I mean, not under the current situation in Israel, unfortunately. And just think about the fact that today Palestinians in Israel are about 20%, and even though that we are relatively, small minority, we can't really threat the political hegemony of the Jewish majority. Even under this situation, we are in a continued attack to delegitimize our rights and not recognizing our rights. So think about the fact that the Israeli leaders will be open to give rights when Palestinians are 50% or 55%. So unfortunately, this issue now is not really part of the political discourse. Definitely not among the Jewish community.
And when we talk about Hamas in the Gaza Strip and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, is there any cooperation within these groups with the Arab members of the Knesset? Or is that completely disconnected?
Well, when it comes to Hamas, definitely it's an illegal, cooperation. So. Even some charity work that was done by the Islamic movement within Israel was considered as, supporting terror activities. So the Islamic movement in Israel was banned and was outlawed and was considered as a terrorist group. And it's like in my neighborhood, many of my neighbors who were, in the Islamic movement, and I know about their daily work, charity work, helping families, helping orphans, they were declared kind of like as, helping, a terrorist and engaging in terrorist activities. When it comes to the Palestinian Authority, we are in, ongoing, communications, try, to work together on issues like the issue of the rights of the prisoners in the last hunger strike. but also there are some legal limits, in this kind of work. And because of this work, there is a lot of attacks on us as an MKs. For example, whenever we, have a declaration in support of the strike of the Palestinian prisoners, automatically we will be referred to by, right-wing MKs that we are supporting terrorists or that we are protecting terrorists. So that's an immediate accusation by the right wing.
And again, I can ask this question to both of you. In light of the current situation and the hawkish government, do you see an end in sight, or do you see something that would change the situation and where there would be an outcome to the conflict? What do you think is the outcome to the conflict in the next 20 years? It's a very loaded question, but I want to know your opinion.
Well, I think I mentioned that in my talk. I think the outcome of the conflict has been determined for a very long time. Israel established a single state over all of Palestine with exclusive rights for people like myself at the expense of Palestinians. That, besides being immoral and unjust, is not sustainable. The Palestinians are already a majority over all of historic Palestine. 2 million people without water and without medicine living in Gaza. The situation in Jerusalem is intolerable. Palestinians living in Jerusalem with this quasi, whatever it's called, residency. People who have been living in Jerusalem since the days of Salah ad-Din have less rights than me, and my grandparents immigrated, from Russia. So it makes absolutely no sense, and I don't think it's sustainable. I think the state institutions, the Zionist state institutions, are already falling apart. The three pillars of the Zionist state, which were the healthcare, education, and the security forces, are all crumbling. They're all corrupt. They're all bankrupt. And again, this is not sustainable. And I think it's only a matter of very short time before the whole thing collapses. And on top of that, we've got the strengthening of the BDS movement. Even with Israel's attempt to equate BDS with terrorism, they're losing. They're frantically going into colleges and universities in the US. They're frantically talking to American politicians to pass anti-BDS laws, and it's all falling apart. It's useless. The BDS call is becoming stronger. More and more groups and churches and colleges are supporting the BDS campaign against Hewlett-Packard, against HP. I have a friend who's a reverend, who's a preacher at a black church, a very big black church in Washington, D.C. They declared themselves HP-free. So, I mean, more and more Christians are coming to Palestine, not because they're looking for Jesus, but because they want to find out how they can help Palestinians and how they can move forward. So I think the end is predetermined. I think it's going to be very similar to what happened in South Africa, when it might be Netanyahu or it might be somebody else who steps up one day, like de Klerk did in South Africa, and declares that all the prisoners will be freed unconditionally. The occupation, the military operation will end in the West Bank and Gaza, and free and fair elections will be called, and that's going to be the end of it. Exactly what will bring that about, of course, nobody knows, but I think it's within sight. I'd be very surprised if it takes more than 10 years.
That's hopeful. If anybody in the audience would have a question, we'd be happy to take them. Okay.
I have a question to Mr. Peled. It wonders me how you came to your view, as you have been raised in a Zionist family. So it is very difficult to change the view when you grew up in another context. Please.
Well, there's a short answer and there's a long answer. The long answer is in the book. So
Give me the middle one.
You have to read the book if you want the long answer. The short answer is I met Palestinians. So I grew up the subtitle of the book is called The General Son, but the subtitle of the book is A Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. What does that mean? It's Palestine. First of all, Palestine and Israel is the same place. And it's a very small place. So what's the journey? I mean, it's a very short journey geographically. But when you grow up as the colonizer, when you grow up as the privileged white colonizer, even if geographically the oppressed colonized are very nearby, which they are, the Palestinians and Jewish communities are very close geographically, because the division is so deep, because the segregation and the racism are so effective. I grew up in Jerusalem. I never met Palestinians. I met Palestinians in America for the first time. I mean, I saw Palestinians. I never met Palestinians. So I embarked on that journey to meet Palestinians. It started in the US, actually. And then I took the very courageous step and I drove to al-Fahim. Very big step it was to drive in al-Fahim and ask for directions. And in Nazareth, which is absurd because this is within Israel, what I used to call Israel proper, which is 1948 Palestine. Then I drove to the West Bank, and then I was sure I was going to die. I describe it in the book, my first trip by myself driving to the West Bank, to a small village called Bil'ain, which is where they have the weekly protests. All I saw, I didn't see the olive trees, I didn't see the beautiful landscape, I only saw Arabs waiting to kill me, So, but I took that journey because the fear and the propaganda didn't make sense. And so that's how I ended up reaching the conclusions and with such determination, basically meeting Palestinians, taking that step and meeting Palestinians.
Thank you. Other questions, please?
Yes, question to both. After the Nakba, there was a concept of transfer. There were ideas of transferring Palestinians away from Israel. There was
transfer?
a concept of transferring
Palestinians.
Transferring the Palestinian minority outside of Israel. They tried to send them to Libya, and there were a lot of concepts. This has disappeared in the last year, but in view of the Netanyahu policy and the idea of annexing the West Bank and all the radical policy, you think there's a chance that such a policy should be revived? And how do you, if such things happens, how do you see the reaction of international community? Don't let's speak about Trump and the USA, but the EU, for instance.
I mean, you're definitely right about that. After the Nakba, there was some, second thought about this quote-unquote mistake of leaving, some Palestinians, within the newly established state. And there were some, plans to transfer, our community even to Argentina. Serious plans. To what extent that is, the threat is still there, it is there. When the Minister of Defense in Israel, Avigdor Lieberman, says clearly, I don't know if you know this, but when he said that we can't accept the establishment of Palestinian state in the West Bank with no Jews, and Israel will continue to live with 20% who are Palestinians, our community. So he said that plans should include transfer. He used transfer, that's the English word, but the word in Hebrews, this maybe, he didn't use the word transfer, moving population and changing borders. So it was not about just changing borders, but also the idea of moving population, which is definitely means a transfer. So I think that the threat is there, and we feel that the threat is there. Especially that they are trying, to cover it with saying that it's not about moving you physically from your land, but it's about changing the borders. But changing the borders would, disconnect us from our, historical lands and historical people and historical homeland. Something that we are finding very hard to try to convey this message to the Jewish public. That our connection also to Jaffa and to Akka and to Lid and to Ramle, no less than it's to Nablus and Jenin and etc. So it's not about changing the borders as the Israeli government is trying to present it. It's basically an actual transfer that would disconnect us from our people and from our extended lands and extended community within Israel proper.
I'll say just quickly, number one, the Nakba has not finished. So I think it's important to state that. The Nakba, the catastrophe, began in 1948. It hasn't finished yet. It's still going on. And the transfer, perhaps the transfer where they put people in trucks and drive them away, while they would do it, I think, immediately if they could, is a threat, but maybe is not happening right now. But there is a transfer going on when you look at the ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem, when you look at the racist laws that we heard about earlier. This is all an attempt to make sure that people can't come back, and couples who are married from different parts of Palestine cannot live in Palestine, so they have to eventually leave and go somewhere else. This is all part and parcel of the transfer. And the massacre of Kufr Qassam, which we heard about as well, was one such attempt. I don't know if you know the history, but when the massacre of Kufr Qassam happened, it didn't happen as planned, because there should have been massacres in several villages and hundreds of thousands should have been fleeing. For some reason, the massacre only took place in one village and nobody fled. And so the intent, I believe, to get rid of the Palestinians is very much alive, and the danger for Palestinians is absolutely imminent.
What hinders them to do it?
I'm sorry?
What are the obstacles to do it for them?
Well, this is the obstacle. This is the obstacle. This is why they're not doing it. If they could, they'd put them on trucks, but they're doing it in just a slower way. And the idea to annex Area C it's also a part of that. They're going to make life is already practically impossible. They'll make it worse, so the Palestinians do leave. I think it's important to realize also that the Zionist plan is a 100-year plan. In other words, the Zionists, in quotation marks, we're going to get rid of these Arabs one way or another. And we're going to do it, some by killing, some by denying them water, some by making life miserable, some by not allowing them to return. I mean, there are various ways in which this works. And the only reason there is some semblance of safety, very small semblance of safety for Palestinians, is because of the international community. It's because of this.
Hi. I have one question concerning I'm here. Concerning the impact of the Arabic Spring. I mean, since the 2012. I mean, what's happened in Egypt, let's say in Syria, in Libya and Yemen recently. How is the impact of these changes on the life of let's say inside Palestinian in Israel? I mean, what is happening there? How the people are looking to these events, how the laws are changing if we consider these events. I'm not sure what you said, Mr. The representative of the BDS, that in 10 years things will go in the direction that you mentioned. I have the feeling that the things will go in the other direction, because all the countries, I mean, in the neighborhood of Israel, they are like collapsing, which make like Israel more stronger. This is, I don't know, this is my opinion, but
Okay.
my question, I mean, the point that I'm trying to reach with my question is, how the Palestinian inside Israel are looking for these events in related to Arabic Springs.
Thank you.
Generally speaking, the events in the Arab world since 2011 didn't serve definitely the Palestinian cause, because many of the focus, many of the international focus and international work and international energy has been channeled into Syria and Libya and still going on. And it was more difficult for Palestinians to still keep their issues alive among all these developments, and to attract the attention of the international community. Just one example to give you, even the Red Cross in Israel and Palestine, who was basically responsible for arranging visits of Palestinian families into the Palestinian prisoners in Israel, decided to cut the numbers of these visits, saying that I will need these resources to invest in the Arab countries, at the expense definitely of Palestinians. When it comes to Palestinians in Israel, I think one of negative ramification of the events in the Arab world is that it added to the internal discussion and the internal split of the community. People are very emotional about what's going on in Syria, but there is a deep split in our community. Some of our community are very passionate about Bashar al-Assad and see him as a corner stone for the resistance, along with Hezbollah, etc. And others are saying that he is a murderer. And this strong division has resulted in some of internal tension within the community. But luckily, I think we were successful in trying to to contain these differences, and still work together. There is an umbrella group that unify all political parties within the Arab Palestinian community in Israel. We call it the High Follow-up Committee on the Arab Affairs in Israel. So the challenges were there. It was sometimes it's very difficult to deal with the internal discussions and tension among about what's going on in the Arab world. But luckily, so far, we were able to contain that.
Okay, I think we'll take one more question. Anyone? Yes, sure.
I'll just be brief, but when I said 10 years, I didn't mean it's going to be an act of God. It's going to be 10 years if we do our job. If we sit around and wait, it'll never happen. So it's up to us to make it happen. I believe it can be done. I think all the cards are in the right place for it to happen. But if we sit and wait, nothing's going to happen. So it's incumbent upon us to make it happen in the next 10 years. In a way, it's a bit of a challenge, I think, for everybody to get up and act a little bit more, or a great deal more, be more active. There used to be a list of countries that Israel called the Refusal Front, Hazit al-Saruf. Now, I'll share with you the list of the countries and see what happened to those countries. These are countries that Israel didn't like, wouldn't discuss, wouldn't cooperate or collaborate with Israel. Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen. You think it's a coincidence that they're all smashed and gone? On the other hand, you've got the regimes that are the good, moderate regimes. And we look at Egypt and Jordan, and of course not all the Gulf states anymore, but some of them, Saudi Arabia and so on. So I think that has a great deal to do with what is happening. I mean, the state of Israel has a great deal to do with what is happening around the other world, in the countries that are around it. And I think it's something important for us to keep in mind in terms of how destabilizing Israel is.
Okay, I think that was a perfect note to end on. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for making it all the way to Switzerland. I'd also like to thank our translator, Mrs. Nirajil. That was excellent translation. It was a very long 2.5 hours, so thank you very much. Of course, the GSP runs on donations, so we would be very grateful if you'd like to contribute anything. There'll be collection baskets at the door, so please help us out if you can, in any way you can. And one more thing, we have a lot of copies of Miko Peled's book in German and also in English, and he'll be signing them over here, so please feel free to come by the table. Thank you very much again. Have a great evening.